In 6 inches of soil, our world comes alive. A podcast of passion where all souls thrive.
We don't need pesticides to feed the world, and we need to learn to embrace and love our weeds, but also our bugs, and also our soil as well.
We've got the World Wide Web, the international nature of the bug world, or the fungi is just as extraordinary. And sharing the space is critical.
Like I said, it doesn't disappear from the soil. It remains, it kills things, it harms soil microorganisms, it runs off into water, it kills aquatic systems. So I think looking at direct impacts on soil, but also how and what pesticides do when they pass through soil and leave soil as well, it is very, very overlooked.
I don't know if you guys have seen what's happening in the US, but for home gardeners, Bayer has changed the recipe for Roundup. So there's no glyphosate in Roundup anymore because of that concern of banning. And instead they've put diquat and triclopyr in it, which are both residual, incredibly harmful poisons that now you've got people who are gardening not realizing that the formulation's changed.
I want to hear your 1-minute defense as to why I shouldn't hate the humble mosquito. Go.
Building our future through Earth's living grace.
Well, welcome, soil mates, to another exciting episode of 6 Inches of Soil, the podcast. I am joined by superstar producer Claire Mackenzie. Hi, Claire.
Hi, Rich. For this one, I should be in my garden, but I'm not sure our audio would be so good if that was happening.
Yeah, I know. We should have done that. That would have been good, or at least have some sound effects. So we thought it was about time to make an episode for the home gardener, maybe the non-farmer, and we've got some really excellent, exciting guests into the mix, all of whom Claire provided, actually. So do you want to give a brief background on the special guests? Yeah, and then we've also got something new for you, the listener. In the outro, we've got a very special guest from the US, which I'll talk about in a sec. But yeah, who have we got this week, Claire?
So we brought in two people who are actually stars of 6 Inches of Soil, the documentary. If you haven't seen it, you can watch it on Apple, Amazon and YouTube Movies. You can also book screenings as well still. Just have to get that in there. So first of all, Vicki Hurd. Now, Vicki Hurd was also integral part of the planning and advice given to us. And also she brought on board Sustain as a partner to 6 Inches of Soil, and sat down with Vicki right at the beginning in 2021, and she's got years of experience campaigning, and at that point was working for Sustain, now works for the Wildlife Trust, but very much with the head of talking about sustainable farming and regeneration, etc. So that's Vicki. She's done a beautiful book which we allude to, and that is all from her interest and fascination and expertise from a sort of biological point of view, but for bugs particularly. So she's absolutely fascinated. And if you go on her Instagram, you see all the pictures. And then we've got Nicole who's in the film, who I met through the Land Gardeners, who were phenomenal. And I met her when she was beginning. She came over to the UK. She's a New Zealander that now lives in the States. But she came over because she was beginning to train more people up, mostly farmers. And some of them work for large land agencies as well. Her belief, or most people's belief, I know, Richard, you work obviously with Gabe, is that we need more expertise on the ground. So she's got this Create course. Nicole's take is really wonderful, very earthy, but some of it sort of deep psychological analysis as well, when people are taking that jump and change. The biggest thing is mindset change. So she brings that, and I love it because she's going to talk about reading the weeds, my favourite bit chapter. And then Nick Mole, I heard talking at the ORSC, the Oxford Real Farming Conference in January, and he works for PAN, and they are the pesticide awareness network. So PAN basically are always campaigning about the use of artificial chemical inputs and what they are, what they do, how they the good, bad and the ugly side of it. So, and he speaks passionately and brilliantly. So I think all three will bring different perspectives to the conversation.
Yeah, I'm really excited. What an array of guests. That's cool. And we tried to get, I called Gabe up and said, who would you recommend we talk to about home gardening? And he didn't even skip a beat. He said, you need to talk to Marni Thompson, who's a long-term friend of Gabe's who lives in the next door state. And although we couldn't get the timing to work out to have her on the same recording as the guests, we have her as a special guest for the outro to listen to the episode and review it and discuss it. And so really looking forward to chatting with Marni at the end. So definitely stick around for that. And before we get started, Claire, what have you been up to this last week or since we last spoke?
Yeah, it's beginning to warm up here in the UK, and so my fascination with blossom is beginning to. I'm beginning to enjoy the hawthorn is beginning to appear. I've been listening to people planning what's going to go in my garden, or what I'm going to do with my garden, or not do with my garden. How I've been doing a bit of weeding and mulching, but a bit more wood chip on. So I'm prepping up, which is all what we're going to discuss, and I'm thinking about how I can keep enhancing biodiversity, nature, get more diverse plants in, and I'm fascinated with perennials. So yeah, that's me. How about you, Rich?
Well, I've been lucky enough to go into the classroom, literally. I went to do a bring your dad to school day. Is that a thing? I don't know. So I was talking to a bunch of 7, 8, 9 and 10-year-olds all about soil, about 6 inches of soil. We did a slake test in the classroom, which actually went completely according to plan, which was really fun. And the kids really seemed to engage with that and enjoy it. And then we broke some eggs.
What's the slake test? You got to tell us.
Good question. So slake test, you get 2 jars of water, 2 separate jars of water, and you can spend chicken wire in it, and you get 1 clump of one soil type and 1 clump of the other soil type, and you put them in this jar so that the soil is fully submerged, and you see what happens as the water interacts with the soil. And in theory, good soil is stable, it has really good stability, and it has the ability to soak the water into it without losing its structural integrity. And soil that's been very degraded doesn't have that. So in theory, if you put very degraded soil in, it starts to basically fall to bits. And so very quickly the water will turn quite cloudy, and you'll see it through the walls of the clear beaker. And yeah, it worked really well. We actually got some soil from our back garden as hopefully the good soil, which it did turn out to be. Actually behind our back garden, we have a kind of untouched kind of verge, which was perfect. And then I got some soil from a nearby corn farmer's field, and it worked really well. Kids seemed to engage with that. And then we also broke some eggs in the classroom. So we got some regen eggs, and then we got some kind of factory farmed eggs, and we broke them in white bowls so we could have a look at the yolk and the consistency of the white and the differences between the two things. Anyway, it was really fun. But I'll tell you, the thing that was really exciting was a couple of days afterwards, when I was doing school pickup, one of the mums came to me and said, what were you talking to my daughter about? Because this weekend we were making our breakfast and I was using some regenerative milk to pour on her cereal. And she said, "Oh, Mummy, do you know about regenerative? It's actually really good for soil and really good for the planet." And she stopped in her tracks and looked at her daughter, who's 9 years old. And that was very exciting for me to hear that actually the message has, slightly seeped into their brains, which is good. Anyway, so that was fun.
You've got a new profession now.
I think I'm going to quit my day job and start touring schools around the world. Well, anyway, this has been a very long intro.
Well, I do have one idea that you and I need to go to Newcastle University as alumni. So is there anyone from Newcastle University? I do have one professor in Durham who works very closely with Newcastle on soil. So I think next time you're over.
Yeah, we should do that. We should do that for sure. Well, without further ado, thank you very much, Soilmates, for joining us. Enjoy today's episode and let it begin now. Okay, Soilmates, welcome to the latest and greatest episode of 6 Inches of Soil, the podcast. We thought it was about time to reconnect with, some familiar friends for those who have seen the documentary, new friends maybe to listeners of the podcast, but the thinking is a lot of our listeners aren't necessarily big commercial farmers. Many, like me, maybe just have a small home garden and are really interested in this regenerative agriculture movement and wanting to help the soil. And so we wanted to give
you, the listener, a chance to get into that world. If that's you, if you are a homeowner, maybe you have a vegetable patch, maybe you don't, maybe you run a golf course or a football pitch or something. What are some of the things that you can maybe start to think about? We've got with us Nicole and Vicki. And so maybe, Nicole, I'll start with you. Do you want to kind of explain what your connection is to soil and introduce yourself to the listeners? That would be amazing.
Well, thanks for inviting me on. My connection to soil, my background is soil science, ecology. As a professional, I've been involved in soil compost since 2000. So 26 years of working with soil compost. It really shifted into education and consultancy and now coaching. So we coach and provide education around the world. Before COVID, we were working with around 3 million acres, and now we work with organizations that cover over 30 million acres in really thinking, how do we shift the system that's holding the chemical in place? I think it's a passion that's never faded, because I think there's always something to learn about soil.
Yeah. Well, we're really glad you're here. You're from New Zealand, right?
Yes, originally Kiwi. Increasingly for the last 12 years, 13 years, been moving more and more into the States. So I actually live in Montana now, just north of Yellowstone National Park.
That's amazing. We have actually a pretty surprisingly good listenership down in New Zealand, so they'll be very pleased to hear your accent. Yeah, love the Kiwis. I was lucky enough to spend a year there between school and university, so I'm very, very fond of New Zealand. I was a terrible sheep farmer out there and drove some combine harvesters and managed not to crash them, so that was good. And so coming on to you, Vicki, what's your connection to soil, and particularly 6 inches of soil, because that's all interlinked, right?
I'm very much in love with the 6 inches of soil team and their work and the film and what they've done since its release. But my relationship with soil and all the the living system starts with the fact that I ended up testing pesticides on slime molds back in 1988, I think, or 1989,
Wow.
for a master's degree, and then going on to looking at pest control. Well, actually, it was for a degree, and then I did pest control in the master's. But it was a master's. It was looking at the better ways to control pests. So it was looking at the integrated pest management, managing farming systems in a diverse way, so you reduce the pest loads, etc., etc. It was also exploring genetics and genetic modification, things like that, which seems quite ironic to me, because here we are 36 years later, still talking about whether genetic engineering is the solution. And I was talking way back then, and it was, we had huge issues with it then, but it's actually in terms of the system that's fault, not single things that you can do. Anyway, so I started volunteering at an environmental group, Friends of the Earth, and I never really stepped away. But I maintained an interest, particularly in invertebrates, because I ended up doing a lot of work on invertebrates and insects in that world. So I wrote a book called Rebugging the Planet a few years ago. And obviously there's loads of invertebrates that people don't know about. Right? Yeah, it was fun doing the book. I really enjoyed it. I'm a campaigner by background now. I'm an academic, I feel, but really I'm just a campaigner. And writing the book was fun because it was able to pack in all this great stuff about inequality and justice and pesticides and worms, all of it together, and springtails. I love springtails, which are, obviously very important in soils, but passionate about them. And I was able to talk about the amazingness of invertebrates, but also why we need to look after them, and above and below ground, absolutely critical. Now I work at the wildlife trusts, and it's interesting because wildlife folk, loads of them do get the role of soil, but I think there's still a job to be done to get them to be passionate about it as they are about birds and plants and wonderful above ground, showing the unbelievable nature of soil, a living thing, but also listening to it. I love the ecoacoustics. Nicole, you've probably come across this a lot. Listening to the soil is a way of getting kids interested, because they can't always see, Anyway,
Yeah.
it's above and below ground, it really matters. And often at the interface, there's lots going on, as there is, in hedges and things. Edges are often important places too.
Yeah, and just before we move away from your intro, what's your favourite insect and why? And I need an above ground one and a below ground one, and you're only allowed one, just
That's
one.
so hard. That's so hard. I'm always getting asked this in talks, and I end up saying cockchafer because above ground, it's an amazing beetle. I love them. They're slightly, hard of sight, and they bump into you. And they were actually taken to court by the French government many centuries ago for the damage they did to crops. Yeah, they were taken to court, and they were banished from the country because of the damage they did to crops. Their grubs are huge, and they will eat and the adults will eat crops as well, but they're beautiful, stunning, and I'm going to get a tattoo for my 60th birthday of cockchafer. Below ground, I'd have to say springtails. Talk about stunning and varied and amazing, and more people need to know them. And I want to see a Pixar movie about springtails if it's not already there. I don't think I've seen one. That's what I'm working towards. That will be a life goal.
Well, as you were explaining the first one, I thought that's surely a movie, The Insect That Got Taken to Court. That is something I would love to watch.
Yeah, it would be a great one, wouldn't it? Except that they were banished, which is really sad.
Okay, well, yeah, maybe we could change the ending. Well, that's amazing. And Nick Mole, coming on to you. Thank you for joining us this morning. My question to you is, how are you connected to the soil? And maybe just introduce yourself to the listeners.
Yeah, hi. I'm Nick, UK Policy Manager with the Pesticide Action Network UK. How am I connected with the soil? I suppose you could go with my last name, which is Mole. So I've always had a certain affinity for it above ground and below ground. So I don't know whether that's a calling. Obviously, my interest is in pesticides. Pesticides wherever they're used, whether that's people's homes and gardens or in our towns and cities, or widely known in agriculture as well. And of course, the impacts that pesticide use have on the soil. But I think it's not just the direct impacts of pesticide use on the soil. It's what pesticides have allowed agriculture to become. Without pesticides, we wouldn't have the intensive agricultural systems and the monocultures, etc., that we have, which have proven and shown to be so detrimental, so harmful to the quality of our soil, but also their impacts on climate change and biodiversity in general. So that's sort of where we're coming from, and as the only UK charity that is focused specifically on all the harms that pesticides cause and bring in their wake. Soil use and soil health is obviously a really big consideration, but I think it's worth pointing out that actually the impact of pesticides on soil health is an issue that has been overlooked for far too long. It's just been largely ignored. Certainly ignored by regulatory authorities. There's a bit of lip service to the impact on soil organisms, but not really within the risk assessments. There's not, it's the general answer is, it just biodegrades as soon as it hits the soil. I mean, that's particularly true of things like glyphosate, which is an interesting case in point, particularly when you look at its use in so-called regenerative agricultural systems. But actually, glyphosate doesn't disappear from the soil. It remains. It kills things. It harms soil microorganisms. It runs off into water. It kills aquatic systems. So I think looking at direct impacts on soil, but also how and what pesticides do when they pass through soil and leave soil as well, it is very, very overlooked. And we, as an organisation, are probably as well. I mean, we're not in charge of regulating it, so we're not as guilty as the government and the regulators, but we are guilty of that, ignoring that key issue. Although some of our colleagues, for example, Charlie Clutterbuck, who Vicki knows well, has been banging on about the impacts of pesticides on soil for decades. So it is there, but I think there's certainly room and scope for much more focus on it across the board, and the impacts of pesticides on our soil and what that means for what we grow and for what lives in the soil as well.
And Nick, when I go home to stay with my mum and dad, they have a little potting shed. They've got a vegetable patch, and I've got a vegetable patch specific question for you, Nicole, in a sec. But Nick, I still find little spray bottles of Roundup in the potting shed, even after my job and all this. So my question to you, Nick, is what should I be telling my mum and dad? If obviously get rid of the glyphosate, but what should they be using instead?
Get sort of asked this a lot, and unfortunately there's never really one size fits all answer. It's very condition and site specific. So what are they trying to get rid of and where from would be my response. And if you could narrow it down a bit, then we could talk about it. But in terms of generally suppressing weeds. There are all sorts of things from, obviously hand weeding is great. It's also great exercise, but mulching, proper mulching and covering and
Yeah.
different plants, using different plants, plants that will outcompete weeds, plants that will grow above weeds, plants that are more suited to that particular environment. So native species, etc., are better. And if they grow showy annuals, just tell them to get rid of them because they're rubbish. They don't do anything for anyone. They don't help pollinators. They cost a load of money and a lot of effort. So get things that actually fit and work in the garden, because I've seen lots of places. I went to a wonderful park in Belgium, and where they used to have very formal, the sort of, the things you see on films about Marie Antoinette with the formal flower beds and stuff. They've taken a lot of them out and they've planted sort of local native species which look equally wonderful, but done them in the same formal way. So you've still got the shape of the beds, but you've got all these wonderful things that they actually also fit with the surroundings, but also mean they don't have to use herbicides or any of the other things that people are using. So, yeah, there's a lot of strategies that can be done to replace glyphosate. The trouble is, it's been ingrained in people for so long, whether that's through the gardening programs or the gardening press or just in general, and the fact that you can go and buy it in the supermarket. Well, it's got to be wonderful if you can buy it in the supermarket next to the beans. It's very difficult to change minds as we are so far along, and of course with the various the government and whatnot saying, well, it's perfectly safe. That gets stuck in people's heads. So we need, not just on a personal level, but we need, I think, a lot more people to step up and say, well, no, that it's possible to do without these things. That's how we're going to get long-lasting, deep societal change and the approach to pesticides. I mean, the simple thing would be to ban sales to the public. That would be my number one call, and you could do that tomorrow, and that would force change. So
yeah,
that would be my solution.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I was chatting with Claire last week about Claire read an article written by one of the groundskeepers at the Cambridge colleges and their pristine green lawns with perfect lawnmower stripes. And one of the groundskeepers had talked about how there was so much glyphosate that the rubber on the sole of his shoes had started to get worn down by the glyphosate. I mean, that's pretty insane. Yeah. Anyway, it really does a lot of damage.
Yeah, it does. And actually, a lot of it's driven by this sort of neat and tidy approach. There's this need to control nature and not understand that actually that weeds aren't, weeds are just plants. Weeds are, weeds. I really don't like the term weeds either, but, they're just plants that have their own inherent value and beauty. But that, again, is this sort of societal need for manicured lawns that must be, a 1/16 of an inch in length and all that sort of nonsense. But I think attitudes are changing. They're starting to change a little bit, and that can only be a good thing, but there's still quite a long way to go.
Yeah, definitely. And so, Nicole, coming on to you, I've got a very specific question for you, which is from my dad, who just turned 80, and he does have this little vegetable patch. And he said, if clover or mustard was planted in the veg patch last summer, should it be pulled before planting vegetable seeds and fresh clover and mustard this spring? I've been encouraging him to put cover crops, not having exposed soil. So he's doing all of that. But now he's wondering, how do I then plant this season's crop of asparagus or broccoli and carrots and all those fun things that he grows? What do you think?
Before we move on, I just want to follow up with Nick's points. And I think our attitude and our mindset is so critical in this conversation and the whole concern about looking tidy. I don't know if you guys have seen what's happening in the US, but for home gardeners, Bayer has changed the recipe for Roundup. So there's no glyphosate in Roundup anymore because of that concern of banning. And instead they've put diquat and triclopyr in it, which are both residual, incredibly harmful poisons that now you've got people who are gardening not realizing that the formulations change. So I would disagree and say banning glyphosate's not going to move this dial. It's going to get people shifting to harder chemicals like paraquat. So I'm really interested in this bigger conversation, which is around how do we build observations? How do we build that understanding that we're growing food and what does food quality look like? So to the question of clover and mustard, you can plant straight directly into the clover depending on what you're trying to grow. But mustard, and again, it depends on what it is and what what variety and what you were using it for. There's techniques where you might turn it in because you're trying to, it actually, like oriental mustard releases a fumigant, so it releases a type of cyanide. So we use it for perhaps controlling nematodes or insect pests under the soil. So those biofumigants are tools. This whole idea of rotations really came about from large scale operations. And I feel like home gardeners, sometimes we get into this mentality that we can't follow this with this. And I think in some ways it's true. Like if you've got permanent, say, tomato beds and you start to see disease building up. But there's a nuance to it, and without kind of seeing what species has he got. But yeah, there's a lot of things you can plant following mustard. Probably not another brassica, perhaps.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, I'll get him to take photos, and you will be now bombarded with lots of photos. So I've read about you reading the weeds, and I wanted you to say more about that. What do you mean by reading the weeds, and how can we make friends with them and perhaps rebrand them?
Yeah, well, for me, they're indicator plants. So thinking about what could this plant be indicating in my situation. So I have published a book. I forget about that. It's called For the Love of Soil, and there's a whole chapter in there in reading indicator. Oh, thanks, Claire. Reading those indicator plants. So there's 5 interrelated reasons for why you might be seeing specific plants. Some of them might be covering bare ground. You know, nature abhors a vacuum. So if you're kind of tilling soil or spraying it and trying to keep it really clean, then we're going to see some types of plants coming in. It might be things like purslane, wandering lily. There's things that are going to want to clamber and get over that surface quickly. It might be that you have low organic matter, so we have plants specific for that, which might not be in England context. We have some that are mineral imbalances, so we call these dynamic accumulators. So plants that are actually trying to heal soil, and I often think about it like, is there a plant that feels like it follows you around? Is there like a weed and you're like, no matter where I go, there's this weed? And we'll ask the question of what is it trying to tell me, and look into herbal medicine to think about, oh, maybe this plant is for lungs. I think of mullein, plants that are trying to open and help soil breathe are also opening and helping us breathe. Like there's this really interesting flow over between what plants are saying to soil and what they're saying to us as well. So I get really curious about that. And then the other indicator could be microbial indicators. So we see plants that really like very bacterial soils, and most home gardeners I meet have what we call bacterial soils because they're maybe cultivating a lot, they're disturbing soil a lot, and that shifts it towards what we would call bacterial. Then you're going to get early successional weeds that really like that. It might be your dandelion, might be your thistles. There's a bunch of plants that fit into that. And then the last thing might be as a release valve. So we were talking before about glyphosate that was wearing away his shoes, which I'm like, what are you doing? Then we might see these release valve plants that specifically can hyperaccumulate, break stuff down. And a lot of those release valve plants are often ones that can be quite sharp, spiky, poisonous. They're literally telling you to get off the land. And so when we see more and more of those plants coming in, your plant community is telling you that you're the problem and maybe you need to move out.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And Vicki, what about, the bug aspect of all of this? I mean, read articles that you've written about, the loss of biodiversity in gardens and the effect that has on insects and also in our kind of gardens and parks. And perhaps you want to tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, it's funny just listening to Nicole. I've got a lot of dandelions, and I think that might be because I've got quite compacted soil. I feel that's one of the reasons. But yes, and I love having them because I think dandelions are beautiful, but they're fantastic for pollinators anyway. But yeah, I mean, gardens and green spaces in urban places are now known to be incredibly important refuges for the insects and other invertebrates that can't cope with the rural environment anymore. There's a lot of studies now showing that. And if they're good, if you've got a wonderful green corridor of lots of gardens, and those gardens aren't dull monocultures of grass, but are rich, diverse, with flowering and bushes and perennials, trees, they can be an amazing green corridor as well as a refuge for invertebrates to move through, to find mates, to nest, to lay eggs, and to move on. And if you haven't got those green corridors, it's very difficult, like with birds, it's very difficult for invertebrates to move on. Obviously, flying invertebrates have more choice, but they can only fly so far. They need that green corridor. But the gardens themselves are incredible. You know, if you've got a quite a diverse planting pattern, or even a really wilded garden, that's amazing. You are creating an incredible refuge. You're providing the food, the habitat to create a nest. And if you've got walls with holes in, you know, that's brilliant. If you've got walls out, you will see the most incredible bugs, as long as you're not spraying it. I've got the most fantastic spiders, and you might not like spiders, so be it. But if you don't like some bugs, you will like your spiders, because they'll eat those pest bugs. The other thing I often say to people when they say, "What about wasps?" I mean, I have to defend an awful lot of invertebrates when I'm doing talks, and wasps and mosquitoes is one, and I've got a defense for them. But wasps, I mean, goodness me, a single wasp nest can eat a kilo and a half of caterpillars and other beasts. So if you really want to protect your garden from caterpillars, you know, moth and butterfly herbivores, which you might not want to because you like seeing those butterflies and caterpillars and they're fantastic. But if you don't, or if you have a particular patch, try and encourage your wasp nest. And you can do that in all sorts of ways. I do talk about that in my book, but, you know, don't kill them. You know, give them what they need, and what they need in later in the year, you know, when there's not much resource for them in terms of nectar, and then they come for your picnics and they'll come for your soda. So don't worry about it. Just leave them be. Let them collect a bit of food and go on, because they are your friend. And there's loads of wasps that people don't know about. There's extraordinary tiny wasps. There's thousands and thousands of species of wasps in the UK, in America, which are beautiful when you look at them through a microscope, and they are pollinating your plants. You know, they're doing an incredible job. So, but you know, the thing I say to most people, if I don't have much time when I'm saying what to do in my garden, I'm saying be messy, like Nick said, be messy and have diversity. And if you start to grow food, which I think, you know, it's great if everybody grows food, particularly if they get their children to grow food, to be part of the process. How brilliant is that for a child to plant a seed and see a carrot growing from it, to understand all that. But also a lot of food plants are flowering plants, so they're providing some food for pollinators. And it's also a wonderful way to see the invertebrates, and then you can photograph them because they're in your garden. You can get up close with your smartphone, take a picture, and then zoom in. You'll see just how beautiful they are. I mean, the mullein moths, Nicole, you talked about mullein plants. Mullein moths, caterpillars are absolutely stunning. The moths, they're fine, a bit dull. This is often the way with moths. But no, actually, there's some beautiful moths as well. But the caterpillars are stunning, and you will convert people to be insect lovers if you plant some or get some mullein plants in your garden or your green space or your park. So there's lots you can do, but I think, you know, in short, be messy, grow flowering plants, and have a lot of diversity of plants. And ponds is another good one. I would add, if you can put a pond in, or a small ditch, you know, that will be brilliant for hoverflies. Hoverflies are brilliant in all sorts of ways for your garden, because they will pollinate your plants, but also do some pest control as well. And they are brilliant to watch, to listen to, and they're great to photograph as well, because they will stay still for a while. They do hover, but then they will rest on your arm and you can take a photograph of them. So yeah, a pond is quite useful too.
I love how much you're into photography. That's cool.
It's so much we can do now individually. You know, don't have to leave it to the experts. Yeah.
Yeah. And so Nick, coming back to you, one thing that I always think about is garden centers and the products that they're placing in various prevalent positions, trying to encourage chemical inputs. And gardeners are told this is going to help you. This is going to boost your grass health. I live in a neighborhood here in Austin, Texas, where everybody in the neighborhood, they all have like garden companies come out to your house and they spray all kind of weird and wonderful things on the grass, and the grass is all bright green and identical around every single house in the neighborhood except for ours. I hasten to add, where we don't put that stuff on, and ours is definitely quite messy. But I was just wondering what we can do to try and help campaign for change there.
Yeah, this sort of goes back to the point that Nicole made. Just want to point out that our pesticide-free towns campaign is not a glyphosate-free towns campaign. It's a pesticide-free towns campaign for exactly that reason. Because if you switch out glyphosate, and whilst glyphosate is terrible, it's not the worst pesticide in the world, actually. And so things like 2,4-D, better known as Agent Orange, is much worse, and that's often a substitute. So yeah, it's pesticide-free. I mean, what we're campaigning for is a complete ban on the use of all non-agricultural pesticides by anyone. They've done it in France, so there's no reason why they can't do it here. Canada, some of the provinces in Canada many years ago actually brought in bans on exactly that kind of lawn feed, which is for the most part fungicides. And fungicides are particularly harmful, potentially to human health, but also to aquatic organisms, etc. But I mean, our experience here, working largely with sort of local councils, but also with people, what really needs to be done is you need to show that there are viable alternatives that will work, that people can do. And those alternatives, there's a broad spectrum of what they might be. My favourite is do nothing, because you don't need a lawn like that. But that's about education, long-term education, or accepting, a bit more weediness. And that's actually really done. So some London boroughs where they've stopped spraying herbicides have seen, I mean, you're getting red list endangered plant species popping up on the streets of Brixton. In Hackney, they stopped spraying around housing estates. And the first year they did that, 27 native species self-seeded and grew. But what they did was then put information boards out for the people, the residents there, to say, these are the things that are now growing where they once weren't. And the people were like, well, this is fantastic. Who could believe it? And they're out scouring the streets to find ones that have been left off the notice board and find other things. Just from a social cohesion point of view, is getting people out there, but also getting people interested in and understanding nature. And it's this blanket term weed that is basically applied to anything and everything, regardless of what it is and what it provides. We have, I haven't written a book, but we have published a really great guide to pavement plants. So that's for people, the public. I mean, obviously it's applicable to the UK rather than the US, but it's free to download off our website.
Amazing.
And it's a little insight into, if you actually stop the spraying, what you might see on your streets, but also what you can leave. So it also works for sort of like council officers who are out who are doing the weed control. So, well, actually, I can leave that plant because it's going to be dead in 2 weeks anyway, or I can leave that plant because it's really great for bees. This sort of woody invasive, then I might have to control that, and I work out how to do it. But I can't stress enough, and I think we're all aware that the vital role of educating the public about the benefits of these things, rather and turning that narrative round as it's something to get rid of. No, this is something that should and could and must be cherished. I think it is really vital. We've all got a huge role to play in that.
Yeah, and also being thoughtful to what was growing in my area of the globe before we as humans started meddling. And I think about that when I go around different people's gardens and stuff. We're too keen on wanting all the things wherever we are and actually thinking what's suited to where I am and to my rainfall and my temperature and,
It's that point about actually working with nature as opposed to trying to control nature. And I think, the climate change, the biodiversity crisis and everything else is a pretty good indicator that us trying to control and tame nature is not a successful long-term strategy.
Yeah. Nicole, coming back to you, I've got more questions. This is from my friend Steph, who lives up in Massachusetts and has been a day one listener to the podcast. I asked her for one question and she sent me like 7, but here we go. So she's asking, is there something more important than composting that I can be doing for my garden? How can someone reduce their water use while still having a productive garden? And what's your top tip to get the most out of anybody's home garden?
I think that builds on what both Nikki and Vic are saying, right? We want diversity. You want perennials in the system to really that's what builds soil. And I think people think it's composting that builds soil, when really it's the relationship between a healthy plant and that soil matrix and microbiology. And seeing beds get depleted is because something's going on with that plant. That plant's not functioning as well as it could. So do you need to top beds up every year with compost? I don't think so. But I'm often like, how do I replicate what this looks like in nature? If I am disturbing it, then I'm setting that system back. If I look at my beds after I've harvested, potatoes and carrots, and I'm like, okay, I've created this big disturbance event. So one of my favorite things to put into the mix is just wood chips. So I chip soft white woods. That's going to give habitat for our bugs, also important. But that's going to feed our beneficial fungi. So any of your soft, and England's full of them because, England exported these trees to the world. Thanks very much, colonization. So, we're talking willow, elm, poplar, birch, beech, all of those species don't steal nitrogen in the way that we would see perhaps from our more hardwood or even pine, spruce, anything with aromatic oils. I'm not going to put that into my garden because they're antimicrobials. I want stuff that's just, luscious. So a lot of my beds, I'm thinking about it in terms of I'm building a worm farm directly in my garden. So I might put some of my food scraps in there. I'm putting, wood chips in there. I'm just really thinking about that garden as an ecosystem. And the more diversity above ground, then the more biodiversity below ground. And so I do make compost as well because I will take anytime the power line company guy goes past, I'm like, if you have a truckload, just drop it off. I want that material, and also because I'm running horses, then I'm composting that. And no matter what I do, I can't get away from worms. I have tried. They're haunting me. They follow me at night. I don't know where these worms come from, but so it's like, if I can be, actively making that material as well, but it's more like, it's not because I want to make compost. It's that I just want to be an invitation for life. Everything that I do, I want it to be an invitation. I've never sprayed a chemical in my life, right? I've always been, what is it? But then some people are probably like, oh, your garden's super messy and whatever.
Be messy. That's the message.
Sounds great.
Yeah. Yeah. You would love the insects here, Vicki. They're just,
I would.
incredible.
I would. Yeah. You wouldn't I wouldn't leave.
Well, there's a bunch that evolved with bison that like bare ground, a lot of burrowing, pollinating. They're just there's the coolest little like bees. They're awesome.
They're like the scrapes. They're bare ground and they will use them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah. So it's got me rethinking this idea of like no bare ground. It's like, well, I want some bare ground because I need it for some of these pollinator species.
Some of the wasps lay and bees need bare ground to make their nests, and really amazing animals when you see them coming out, bee wolves and stuff. Yeah.
And what about water, Nicole? So obviously, especially where I live in Texas, there are pretty severe restrictions on how often you're allowed to water your garden. How can someone reduce their water use and still have a productive garden? Because I know if I stop watering, then things go brown and die pretty quickly. But it's probably because I've got the wrong things growing. So maybe what's your advice on that?
Well, I think you kind of answered your question there, really. So it's what's appropriate for this landscape. Obviously, building organic matter, but people often don't realize that it's fungi that are creating these hydraulic lifts. So they're bringing water up from deeper down in the profile. And I think too, this is where having shrubs and trees and having things that are just moving the water cycle a little differently. But organic matter is really key in how long can we hold on. I empathize with Texas. I mean, we have a very short growing season here, and it's like, what species are appropriate for my landscape? And are you trying to grow something that was meant to be in England, in Texas, and then holding it up with some water? It's like it's just not a good fit.
Yeah, that's a good point. And raised beds, what are your views on that? A lot of the natural soil types where I am, we're on quite a hard bed of rock, and the soil depth is probably only 3 or 4 inches, if that. A lot of folks around here build raised beds to grow vegetables. How do you feel about that?
Well, I just think if we're thinking about it in terms of water, those raised beds are going to use a lot more water and be a bit more exposed. I'm all for lasagna gardening, building up off that base. But I don't fundamentally have a problem with raised beds. I think thinking about the materials, the timber, what is it off-gassing, these different considerations. when we're building raised beds. I think for some people with your bodies, raised beds make a lot more sense than sitting on the ground and bending over. So no, I don't have a philosophy against it.
Yeah. And especially to your point, Vicki, if it's a good way to get things growing and get kids getting their hands in the soil and not being afraid of soil, because I feel like we need to get better in embracing. How do you go about getting people to love soil, Vicki?
Well, that was kind of the point of the book, where it was more to love insects, and their sort of obviously relationship with the soil is a key part of that, and getting them. It's actually getting the people that are looking after the kids, the carers, the parents, to stop putting that fear of soil and of insects in them. And so I think the second or third chapter of my book is called Rebugging Attitudes, and that almost more important than anything else. And that could be your neighbours, your co-workers in your office, actually having opportunities to share photographs or go and visit a site, or get your colleagues or your family involved in a growing space in a local park, or even just a scrubby bit in your road, or a really crappy scrubby bit in your road, working on that with and you'll find people come past and start asking questions, so you can a bit of community involvement there. But that is all about, when they see a spider, they won't run a mile, or a wasp, or a hoverfly even. Sometimes when I'm doing talks, I do a what's this, a bee or a wasp or a hoverfly, and it's a really fun way of getting them to realize they probably don't know. The black and yellow stripes, there's so many insects, but even if it is a wasp or a bee, it's not going to hurt you. But to get them to understand that there's such a variety out there, and they're all really, most of them are really great. I'd say all of them are great, but we can have an argument about that. But getting them to realize that they won't hurt you if you don't hurt them. There might be times when, and obviously there's problems with some diseases spread by insects, absolutely, but it's often a lot to do with how we've set the system up, and the imbalance in the system creates disease spread that is unhelpful. But at a local level, there's so much you can do to share the love of working with the soil. And I always remember this time when my son, I think he was about 2, he waddled into the kitchen with this hand full of really dirty worms, and I was so thrilled. And and somebody else might say, "Oh no, your hands are dirty, get rid of that." And if I got one person as a result of my book not doing that, I'd feel that was a result, that they would embrace it with the joy that I did that day. But I'm lucky, I'm trained. But the more people know, and the more people that understand and see, and I think there's been a big awareness, a great awareness. I don't know about in the US. I feel there is. My book was very popular in the US, but in the UK, we've got wonderful TV programs, we've got activities, bee watch, butterfly watch, bird watch, all sorts of things people can get involved with, which has changing attitudes. But everybody's got to be part of it.
And by the way, earlier on, you said you have a defense of mosquitoes. I want to hear your 1-minute defense as to why I shouldn't hate the humble mosquito. Go.
Oh, goodness me. Really important food source for many other animals in the food chain. If you removed mosquitoes from many places, a lot of other animals would go. They obviously were originally part of a very important ecosystem, but because we've created such a large volume of livestock that they can, livestock being also humans, we've created a problem. And we have obviously created problems like standing water, things like that, which is what their larvae grow in. And those pieces of water could have a really diverse community of carnivores, like dragonflies, for instance, which will eat the mosquito larvae, but only if you allow a really diverse system in your water systems, in your standing and freshwater systems. And if you don't have such huge volumes of animals and livestock, which are there for the animals to feed. I'm not one of those people who say never use pesticides for health reasons. They've created a massive benefit for reducing malaria in Africa, and I wouldn't go against that. But there are other ways of doing it that which we're starting to invest in, and that's really important too. But they are really important for part of the food chain. And the other one is slugs, and slugs are amazingly important for conversion of nutrients to make because they break down plant matter, which is then available as nutrients for the plants to grow in. So they basically create the fertilizer. So snails and slugs people often ask about as well as mosquitoes, and they are so important. Really look after. And if you've got leopard slugs in your garden, really nurture those, because they eat other slugs. It's a rich world out there, and you really ought, the more diversity, the less problems you'll have.
Yeah, well, the mosquito, slug, and snail community, thank you for that public awareness messaging. Nick, tell us a bit more about PAN, and particularly how can the listener help support the work that you're doing? Because to me, it sounds amazing. But yeah, just tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, okay. So actually, PAN in the UK, we're about to celebrate our 40th birthday this year. Ah, who knew? I've been with PAN for half of that, so this is my 20th year working with PAN. We're actually part of a much wider international organisation. We were established many years ago in Malaysia as a workers' rights in response to the pesticide poisonings that were happening on palm oil plantations there, and I think we might actually be the first organisation to ever raise the issue of palm oil and the harms that it causes, albeit in a workers' health side of things. So we have regional areas. There is a PAN North America who does an awful lot of work, particularly in terms of pesticide poisoning for migrant workers, sort of California and that part of the US. So they do a great deal of work. They've helped also. It's a very different agricultural scene in the US, but they've got huge buffer zones around rural schools where you can't spray pesticides up to avoid the drift going on to children, etc. We've done an awful lot of work in West Africa and Ethiopia with our partners on the ground in Pan Africa. We've helped about 10,000 farmers, cotton farmers, switched from conventional cotton growing to organic cotton production, and the difference that's made not only to the environment but the health of the people around it, but also their income, the farmers' incomes, has been just huge. I mean, it's a huge changing thing. So we've done that. On the malaria thing, we've actually worked across Africa quite a lot in terms of there are an awful lot of pesticide stockpiles of old pesticides being used, but also a lot of work on malaria. A lot of the problems with malaria or the increase in mosquito is about bad standing water, and it's like old tyres where they can breed and that sort of thing. So we did a lot of that. In the UK, we're very focused on, since leaving the EU, on trying to establish a new regulatory system in the UK, because we don't have one that functions at the moment, but we work a lot on that and, sort of trying to change agriculture. But one of the big things is our pesticide-free towns campaign, which is trying to convince councils who are big users of to be honest, it is largely glyphosate because that's the cheap, effective one at the moment, but pesticide in general. We've got about 100 councils of varying sizes across the UK already either stopped or massively reduced and feeding into that.
That covers schoolyards as well, would it? Like playgrounds?
It doesn't, because councils don't own that, but we are working with schools, and we've got a whole policy about not spraying in schools and what schools can do and why they should do that, and we're starting to get pick up on that as well. So yeah, these reductions, and I get to actually go back to one of the points that Vicki said. Our urban spaces are becoming refuges for a whole range of different species, not least farmland bird species, who are being. We've lost about 50% of our farmland bird species since the 1970s. A lot of that is down to intensive agriculture, but also pesticide use, and they're finding havens in our towns. So making our green spaces, making our urban areas pesticide free helps with this to try and reverse or halt the biodiversity crisis we find ourselves in. We touch on an awful lot of areas. A lot of it is about trying to inspire and empower local people, citizens, to develop their own campaigns. So providing them with the information where they can go and campaign for an end to, turn their local park pesticide free, or turn their town or their city or whatever it is they want, but giving people that information, because we're a very, very small team, but we got so much. Everything we provide on our website is free for anyone to use. They can download it, take it, do what they want with it. But it's about, again, it comes back to this whole idea of education and information and awareness raising and getting people to understand that a different future is possible.
Yeah. Well, thank you for all your work. It's amazing, and it's brilliant that you're coming up to 40 years old. Nicole. So, Nicole, part of this episode was also wanting to cover like golf courses, parks, football pitches. I remember reading an interview, I want to say it was with Alex Ferguson, the Manchester United manager, and he said that one of his best signings was the groundsman because he really understood how to keep consistent routes, therefore got the grass much more consistent, so his players got less injured. But obviously we're going to have a hard time chatting to anybody who runs a golf course or Old Trafford and say, right, be messy. So how do you, Nicole, speak to that sector of the world and help them to go more in this direction?
I actually did a whole online series that's freely available with LA Recs and Parks, or LA Sanitation and Environment, looking at this very issue because water use efficiency, insect pests, shallow root systems, treading damage, like all of that has put people on a treadmill to nowhere, really. Some of the golf courses that we've been visiting are spending over $1 million a hectare in managing nematodes, and like the expenditure to keep that chemical spinning is insane. And so that's where really looking at how do we get root systems down, how do we be feeding microbiology and all of those fungicides and pesticides, which for the life of me, you've got kids on these school fields with their faces smashed into these chemicals. It's obscene to me. But we worked with schools in New Zealand like 20 odd years ago where they replaced their entire chemical program with worm extracts, and they were making vermicast from their school waste and then putting those extracts out onto the ground. And that had been driven by kids having allergic reactions to the chemicals that they were spraying on the fields. But for them, it's just been a win-win-win, really. They were seeing a shift away from some of those weed pressures, a much softer turf surface, and then a much deeper rooting system. So these you wouldn't get waterlogging either. I just think it makes so much financial sense to be thinking about these systems biologically. And yes, they're a monoculture, which means you might be putting more biologicals out. You might be using a little bit more trace elements. There's things you're going to have to do to support what really is an artificial system, but go, how do I do this biologically instead of just chasing my tail?
Yeah. And where's that course? That's on your website, is it?
No, it's on YouTube. If you look up LA Sanitation and Environment, it's, I think, like a 14-part series just for turf managers for parks, and seeing some really great examples in California where parks are following this. Like some of these parks have gone organic, but unfortunately, they did that without supporting the educational side or giving people other tools. And so I kind of stepped in right when they're at breaking point, because it's like people can't run around and just be hand pulling weeds on these huge, huge parks. And so this was part of the drive. All right, what are we doing? Are there seed treatments that are biological? How are we thinking about weeds, and doing that kind of training?
Yeah, that's so important. Vicki, quick question to you. 2 weeks ago, I went in to present to my kids' school about soil and the importance of soil and how it's connected to food. A teacher that allowed me to do that, Jennifer Passy is her name. She's a STEM teacher. She asked the question, what can she do as a teacher to help support this whole 6 inches of soil mission with regards to designing a lesson that can maybe fit into her curriculum to promote healthy soil? What advice would you have for a teacher who's really interested to help?
Yeah. That's great. Great choice. I did want to say Manchester United use a garlic spray. Did you know that on their pitch? Which is antifungal, antibacterial. It helps the roots grow and they grow. So there you go, Man United. I thought it was Arsenal, but it's actually Man United. But in terms of teachers, I've actually written a blog about doing rebugging with children, which obviously isn't just soil, but there is so much you could do with soil. You could set up an experiment showing how, if you have a sort of 3 trays, and you can have one tray with just soil on its own, soil with just grass, and then soil with a mixture, lots of different plants, and get the children. I mean, there's a bit of work here and stuff like that. It probably has to be outside, and you could pour water at one end and show how much slower and cleaner the water is coming out if it's going through the rich sward of grasses and plants and other things compared to if it's just bare soil. To get people, to get children to understand the connections within the soil that hold the water in, the sponge that is created by the fungi, the fungal things, which are so extraordinary. Obviously, getting involved with a microscope. There's amazing microscopes you can now get really cheaply on phones or just, handheld, to actually look at what's in the soil. See, I mean, it's very difficult to see springtails and nematodes, but with the microscope you can. So doing some of that, linking up with your local wildlife trusts and other organizations locally, they'll probably be able to help with that. And the other idea, which I've talked about in my blog that I did about soils, which I mentioned earlier, was people provide ecoacoustics. You put a probe down into the soil, and then the children can hear the activities under the soil, because otherwise it's quite difficult, unless they've got amazing sort of visuals, quite difficult to know what's going on down there. So you can hear the clicks and the sludge and the slime and the movements and the crunching, all can then be identified by the sort of wildlife person or soil expert, to identify what's down there, and then you could draw them. And the final thing is to make a really interesting art project out of it, because art is obviously memorable. I've done a few sessions with friends who I talk about the bugs and give pictures, a slideshow, and then the children draw the bugs, and some of them draw extraordinary bugs, absolutely brilliant, and others are really basic, like I would, because I'm a terrible drawer. And then we give them a lump of clay, and they make a plate with bugs on it. And so there's a real sort of rich art memory for the children. I found children are fascinated by bugs. They tend to have that fascination drilled out of them and, horrored out of them by their carers. That's one of the goals of my rebugging plan. But if you bring art into it and show how beautiful they are, that could be one way of making it memorable. But sorry, I've gone on to bugs rather than soil. You can get them to draw the soil, because actually drawing soil even more exciting than drawing a bug. All the interactions and the mycelium of the fungi and the roots and the bugs and the snails and the soil. Anyway, there are lots of different game plans, and I did on my Rebugging the Planet website, I did talk about all the things you can do with children to talk about nature, and lots of links and stuff.
I love it. Well, we're almost coming up to time here. Nicole, what did I not ask you that you wanted to share with the listeners? Did we miss anything?
Thank you. I think, and this will be Nick's wheelhouse, but really, I think a lot of home gardeners who have lawns don't realize when they're relawning that there's the fungicides and pesticides and things like neonicotinoids illegal now in England.
Yeah. Illegal, yeah.
Yes.
Good. But in a lot of countries, they're not. Sorry?
More or less.
More or less, yes.
But it's just being aware of what those seed coatings are. So like reading the fine print and thinking about what something is before you're putting it out. And a lot of commercial, like buying organic seed and just being aware of what's on grass seed. Like it's literally the apocalypse for landscapes. I think just this message really of diversity and messiness and being an invitation. And I think if you love birds and you don't love bugs, you're missing the connection, which is we need bugs in order for birds to flourish. So just starting to really think about your home garden is your ecosystem, right? But yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's been great. How about you, Nick? Anything that I missed that I didn't ask you about?
No, but I suppose I think that the message would be that no, it doesn't have to be like this. We don't need pesticides to feed the world. We need to learn to embrace and love our weeds, but also our bugs and also our soil as well. And one of actually our most, I drew a picture that went out with things, was like bees need dandelions, people need bees. And that's the sort of, that's basic message for everything. It goes to weeds and all the bugs and everything else. But I think a better future is possible, but we all need to just keep on keeping on.
Yeah. Vicki, any last thoughts?
Well, Mark, one of the things that got stimulated by me talking to people about bugs was that people don't realize that bugs talk to each other, and bugs talk to plants, and fungi talk to bugs, and fungi talk to plants. That communication which is going on all the time. And I started writing another book about that, and it's just mind-blowing. The relationship, how the fungi in your stomach are talking to you, they're communicating with you through chemical control, and there's electrical communication. So I think one of the things that I would stress is the people understanding that they're part of a natural system, and that natural system does amazing things, just like humans do. You know, we've got the World Wide Web, the international nature of the bug world, or the fungi is just as extraordinary. And sharing the space is critical. We need to be sharing that space. And in fact, we had a report that was released in the UK a couple of weeks ago about our security. National security is dependent on our natural security. Finally, we have the report that shows that we need nature for us to have a civilized, community here. And that's great. Start to read those things and learn more.
Yeah, well, thank you all for joining us. Your energy and enthusiasm in this space is totally infectious. And I have a trouble doing this podcast in that I fall in love with all of the guests like very quickly. And unfortunately, that's been the case here. So hopefully I get to see you in person and give you a hug to thank you for coming on. It's been amazing. Until next time, listeners, we will see you soon.
Brilliant.
Well, listeners, we are joined by a very special guest for our outro. We've got Marni Thompson, who, when I called Gabe Brown and asked him who should be the person to have when it comes to home gardening and regen ag and how it's all connected, he didn't even hesitate before he said your name. So welcome to the podcast, Marni.
It's great to be here.
So for the listener, just briefly, do you want to introduce who you are and how you're connected to soil and gardening? And then we can talk about the episode that we've just listened to.
Okay, yeah. So Marni Thompson, I live in Montana, in northern Montana, where it is a little bit cold in the winter, short growing season, and very dry in the summer. We get about 10 to 12 inches of precip, so not very much. I grew up on a farm and ranch in southwest Montana, and then I went to college for range management, and then I started working for the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which I've worked for 30 years. And then a couple years ago, I started working for Understanding Ag with Gabe Brown. And so my connection about 15 years ago, a little bit before I met Gabe, I started on YouTube looking at the slake and infiltration tests. And it totally changed my whole perspective. And what I had learned in college was not really what they were teaching. And so I really made it my mission. I became passionate about it. The NRCS sent me to a lot of different places. I got a lot of different training, and then I coordinate a really large effort in Montana to educate farmers and ranchers in soil health. I do that every year. We do a big symposium in Montana. So that has really enabled me to connect with large names like Gabe Brown and a lot of people that we bring in from all over the nation to talk to our farmers and ranchers.
Yeah, that's really cool. So I'm keen to get your thoughts on the episode that we've just listened to. Obviously, we're talking about home gardening, people who aren't necessarily farmers, but are very interested in this space, in soil and diversity, all of these things. What were your thoughts, feelings on listening to the episode? What stood out for you?
Well, it was really cool to hear everybody's different perspectives. Loves all the talk about the bugs because people don't like them, but they are essential and they all have a function. Super important just for everybody to grow their own food just because of the lack of nutrient density in our foods that we can get in the grocery store. So,
yeah, I like the be messy messaging, which kept on coming up again. And I'd never met Vicki before, but she was just amazing. I also loved how you had all the books ready to go to hold up as they got introduced. But what do you think, Claire, of things?
Well, I've just had a pun there. So it's not just be messy, it's be messy.
There you go. Okay.
T-shirt
idea.
Creating illustrations from that one, I think. I personally, Marni, I'd love also to hear your thoughts on public spaces, because one reason for Nicole Masters coming on is she actually deals with really hard things like golf courses and football.
Yes.
And there's Dale Vince, as someone was telling me yesterday in England. Dale Vince runs a thing called Ecotricity, first provider of green energy in the UK. He's an ardent green campaigner, and he started his own football team, and everything there is green. They're managing it all. So I haven't found out yet, but I'd love to get your thoughts, because the amount of pesticides, etc., used in those spaces is full, and there's amazing campaigns happening. And we obviously heard from Nick Mole talking about their work. but all of them brought a different perspective, which is incredible. Just we really on this podcast want to give people access to trying these things out. So love to hear more of those things to inspire people, Marni, because I love the way, the slate test really spoke to you. Similarly to me, I'm crazy for the infiltration when you just see that, and all these different tests, which even just digging into the soil with those spades, and Nicole Masters talks about that endlessly, getting out there, so whoever you are, reconnecting is such a beautiful thing.
Golf courses are tough just because of the nature of what they want them green all the time, and then they're cutting them down so far, which decreases the roots, and then you have to provide more nutrients because the root systems don't work anymore. And I guess to me, it's like trying to think about the soil health principles that we know, right? Minimizing disturbance, making sure the soil is covered, having diversity, which there is no diversity in plants on the golf course, and, having a living root in the soil, and ways that you could do that on a golf course. Now, I think that, when it gets into the messy part, like my parents think my garden is just atrocious, right? Because it's so messy. And it's really changing our perspective of what is good, right? Which, just really goes back to education on those golf courses. They probably don't even know, what it's causing, all the, fertilizer and stuff like that. So maybe there's a way that you could add diversity to those plantings, right? And not just one single species. And trying to add like compost extract or compost instead of fertilizer, and changing our perspective that it doesn't always have to be so green either. But that's probably a tough sell.
Yeah, I know. It seems to me that it would be very manageable to have multiple species of grass. You could still cut it to whatever the Augusta national rules and regulations are for golf, but presumably, like, you could have multi-species, right? And still,
yes,
keep it cut. But I understand the principle of, like, the longer the grass, the deeper the roots. And so if you're constantly keeping it short, it never really has a chance to establish those deep roots. But
no, and that's, it's getting nutrients, and it's just getting it from that short root zone. And pretty soon, probably that's no longer there. And then, so it can't go deeper to bring the nutrients up from deep into the soil. So you'd have to provide nutrients. Now, that doesn't have to be in a fertilizer. It can be in a compost extract, a compost tea. I mean, there's lots of guys doing that. And on large scale, I have producers putting on 5,000, 6,000 acres of compost extract on their seed, in, big equipment and drills. And so it's possible.
Yeah.
Marni, can I ask you a question? If I'm a gardener, so obviously I have perpetual discussion with my husband. He's now made friends with dandelions and other read the weed. I love read the weed. Read the weed is my favourite chapters in Nicole Masters' book. What's the optimum length of grass? So like so you want to mow, but where do you get to so you've still got healthy roots? Is there an optimum length, or are we just meant to be letting it go wild? What are we? And I would also love you to send in, I'll ask all of you some photos of your spaces, because we're alluding to them. I'd love to see them. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah. That is hard. It depends on your context a little bit, right? Because I'm in the short grass prairie, so the grasses are shorter and the root systems are shorter. The tall grass prairie in the Midwest in the United States, really tall grasses, so really deep root systems. And so it'll depend a little bit. I think shortening and cutting grass as much as they do, I don't know that it would be really good for any species. Now, there might be species that are more tailored to that or could withstand that, but it is all hard on it because you're not allowing it really to recover ever, which is key to the plants and making their root systems go deeper.
So I think you should also be trying to work out what the height of that species is when it's fully grown, and you should never cut it shorter than 50% of that height, because the plant is always trying to repair itself at less than 50%. And once between 50 and 100, actually, it's quite good for it to be cut. Like if you're grazing cattle, for example, that's a really good rule of thumb. Like never go more than 50% of whatever the full length is. And then you're going to get much richer ecosystem churn. So that's something that I've I've definitely learned by talking to cattle ranchers. Now, this isn't the home gardener. We definitely, when we cut our grass, I have the lawnmower set on the highest possible setting, and definitely get a few raised eyebrows from people in the neighborhood, but whatever.
Even to do that periodically, like right when they're on a golf course, maybe when it's it's winter, or they don't have as much, or to let it grow taller and different, or rotate that around, the golf course, so that maybe one part of the golf course, the grass is tall, and then the next part, so that you're rotating around, just like a rancher would do with his cattle.
Yeah. Marni, I have a quick question for you, which came in after recording from a friend of the pod, soil mate Juliet Kite in Norfolk, UK. And she asked me about bindweed specifically, which some people call morning glory. So she's trying to grow raspberries and asparagus in Norfolk, like quite sandy soils. And the bindweed is her constant challenge because it comes and suffocates the raspberries and asparagus. What advice would you have for her in that context?
I have the same thing. I have bindweed, and of course I just pull it. And then where I have it really bad, I try to rotate things like my potatoes there, so that I can really dump a lot of residue on that to try and, put it down. And then, when it comes through, I try to pull it, but it is tough. And I think Nicole talked about it, that weeds are telling us something, and I haven't done a lot of research as to like, okay, what is bindweed telling us that I'm missing in my soil? But that would be another route. Yeah, it is tough. I have weeds still. I have bindweed myself, and that's just how I deal with it, but I still have it.
Yeah, it is a tricky thing. But yeah, to your point, Claire, reading the weeds, I think is great. And I think listeners, wherever your context is, if you're being hit by thistles or dandelions, actually, the internet is your friend here. You can work out what that is telling you. And obviously Nicole's book's great for that too. But it is a really interesting concept of thinking that like they're trying to speak to you. You just need to figure out what you're listening to, right?
Well, Mr. Google will tell you something different, because I've just Googled it. And of course it comes up with annihilation and kill. Best weed killer for bindweed. Even though I asked it what it meant. So
yeah. But what's top of mind for you, Marni? Like when you talk to home gardeners and the work that you've done in your career, what are some of your top tips for home gardeners as they look to go down this road?
Top tips, especially in environments where we have a lot less moisture, is to get your soil covered, right? Nature does not like bare soil, and if you don't cover it with something, it will cover it. And usually it's with things that you don't want, like weeds and bindweed. And then eliminating disturbance, whether it be chemical or physical disturbance, very important. And in your home garden, that's a hard concept to wrap your head around, because just like my dad did when I was young, we rototilled in the fall and we rototilled again 2 or 3 times in the spring, right? And that's just disturbing the soil, the microbiome, for the biology. And that's where it all starts, is making that home for the biology so that it can provide nutrients to your plants. So those are 2 big ones, I think, that are difficult, especially not using a rototiller. Well, how do you plant? And there are really lots of options for how to plant when you don't have a rototiller. Trying to rotate species around in your garden. Nature likes diversity. 150 species would have normally been where your garden was. And now you're, just putting one species in one spot every year. And that just drastically impacts the biology underneath the soil. So rotating species around in your garden, there's lots of ways to add diversity to your garden with flowers, planting species right next to each other that like each other. So lots of different options for really incorporating the 6 soil health principles in your garden. And there are lots of people that are doing it. And, my context is different in Montana that it would be in Florida. And so there's, the tools that you may use are a little bit different just based on your context. So,
yeah, that's a really interesting point I want to go back to. So you're saying if we weren't here and you went to kind of any corner of the planet, it would be about 150 species of green things growing.
Probably like when Lewis and Clark came out to, the prairies, I think it was over 150 species that they notated. And yeah, and even if you look at undisturbed native range ground, I mean, you can walk around and count a ton. And then we took that system and, like where I'm at, we grow wheat and wheat and some more wheat.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, you change that much about what's going on underneath the ground, and you're going to have impacts.
Yeah.
I saw a wonderful thing the other day, and I'm going to explore it this year, Marni. So I'd love your insights into this. It's a man. It's on YouTube. He's on YouTube, but it's Medieval Way. Discussed heritage plants and plants that have died off, but were always used, and they're mostly perennials. Things like Alexander's, Skirret, Good King Henry. All these things I've kind of heard of, or some not heard of, and they produce abundant vegetables for people. They have them beside their cottages in England. People but one of them particularly is spinach has replaced it because, of course, it when you pick it, it wilts immediately. Whereas we developed spinach so that we can travel it from Spain to Britain and buy it. So everything we've done is he does these wonderful videos. I will attach this for people to look at, but I'm going to have a go this year, because I'm really into perennials now. I want to keep disturbing less, but I still want to have stuff for my family and me to eat. Right. Do you do that? What have you got?
So I do have perennials in my garden, but nothing like you're talking about, like old species that we don't use anymore. I do have raspberries, so, a perennial. And then I have some shrubs, some fruit shrubs in my garden. I did have some strawberries also, but those are really the only perennials that I have added to my garden.
Yeah, it's a good idea though. I love the idea about changing the species, because most species, especially in agriculture, they're really designed for the modern system. They're designed
totally
for high input, high output. We've covered this on previous episodes, but wheat back in the olden days, before we messed with it, some of the heritage varieties was really tall, but then it's been bred to be shorter and shorter and shorter, so the head can grow more seeds, more grains. So I like that.
And the new varieties are all developed in a medium of not soil really, and it's fertilizer, and so they're accustomed to that. So even taking away fertilizer slowly, like we're trying to do, is a lot harder for those species than it would be the old heritage species. And I've had producers that have tried to find the heritage species and can hardly find them to actually plant them. And so that's really sad.
Yeah. Just one quick thing before we go. You mentioned at the start that everything that you learned in, I guess, university, when you came into the real world, you realized it was different. How do you think we can ever change that? Because it's something Claire and I talk about a lot. I was the same. Claire and I, actually, we both went to the same university up in Newcastle in the northeast UK, but I did agriculture there, and I learned it was all chemistry, right? It was, put chemicals in, get yield out, and that's kind of what farming is. How do you think we're ever going to get that changed so that when little Marni comes through the system again, and in a few years' time, she would learn maybe a different way of doing things? What do you think about that?
Well, education is huge. I think there is a little bit more of it because I have a contact in the university that I went to, and he's now a soil instructor there, and so he does talk a lot about it. But it is difficult, partly because of the research. The research that goes on in universities is largely paid for by fertilizer companies and, chemical companies. And how do you get away from that? And I have had a struggle with that with my own university. And I do have a agreement now with a research station, and we are doing a soil health test on a research farm with Montana State University. And so I just think there's just little things, but there was a lot of opposing views when we started that research study. And we're only in its second year, but people that, really just won't think it will work because we're not, we're trying to cut back fertilizer and we're doing some different things that are non-conventional. So I just think little bit, bit by bit, and you're hearing a lot more about soil health. I mean, like when I first got started. So it's just, unfortunately, slower than we'd like.
Yeah. Well, Claire, do you have any final thoughts before we let Marni go?
No, I'd love to do an episode on this as well, the education, because I was with teachers yesterday and we showed them some short videos on soil, and these are teachers looking to improve their knowledge, but they it was very apparent they don't have the skills to teach it. And this is, so we go on about educating children, but really we need to go back into teacher training, professor training, etc. So I love, you know, every time, Marni, you've added wonderful points I'm going to make and want to share with people. But yes, I would love to, if you can share any of your work with us, that would be incredible. So thank you for your time.
Yeah.
We appreciate it.
Yeah, and I'll send you some pictures of my garden and stuff like that. Is that perfect? Yeah.
Anything inspiring, I think, and any comparisons, if you, even if you want to show some different grass lengths or roots or whatever, just anything to bring it to life.
Homework. We're back in school. We're being set homework by teachers.
I know, right? That's okay. That's how we learn.
Well, soil mates, thank you very much for listening to this episode. As ever, don't forget to follow us so that you can be the first to listen to new episodes when they come out. Give us a like on wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you very much. Thank you, Marni, for joining us for this outro, for this special guest outro. And superstar producer Claire Mackenzie, thank you. And we'll see you guys next time.
All right. Thank you.
In 6 inches of soil, our world comes alive. A podcast of passion where all souls thrive. Soil mates unite in a bold common chase, building our future through Earth's living grace.